A great question I get asked is, does the distance that I allow as a gap between my nocking points and my arrow nock, does that small little gap, does it vary, or what I allow for that size, does it vary based on the axle to axle length of the bow? And it certainly does, because the axle to axle length on your bow has a determination on how sharp that string will be. So if you have a broad, long axle to axle bow and you're only pulling it to this point, well, you can tell this triangle stays pretty broad. So there's not a lot of pinch on that arrow. Whereas if I now shorten this and then pull this back, you can see that the triangle gets smaller. So the smaller the triangle, the more pinch that there's going to be, and that means that you have to have a slightly bigger gap when you have a shorter axle-to-axle bow, or a bow that has a shorter brace height, because a lot of times the bows that have the shorter brace height, that extra inch that it's closer at the beginning means to get to your draw length, it's actually pulling an extra inch more than one that would have a bigger brace height. So the sharper the string angle, the more of the gap you're going to need in between your arrow nock and your nock set. Now, as a rule of thumb, 1 millimeter for me is kind of the number and lower that I always focus on. The other thing that I want to say that determines this angle and this pinch and how much of a gap you have is how long your draw length is. Because think about that. If I have a bow that has an axle-to-axle length like this, and I'm only pulling it this far, well, that's still a pretty broad angle. So there's not going to be a lot of empty space that would need to be removed. Okay, now if you're pulling it this far, now this is a much different string angle, so you would have to have more of a gap than on that shorter draw length. So we have to keep those in mind. Now I'm going to show you 3 nocks here, and all 3 of these nocks have a slightly different spacing. So you can see right here, that's 1 millimeter, and honestly, at a long draw length with a short axle-to-axle bow with a short brace height, that much slack could certainly get taken up. Now the next nock is going to be a little bit in between. This is a nock that has a little bit less of a gap. And then we can go to one of the bigger nocks, an S nock, and you can see now there's virtually no space. So what does this little gap mean? Well, what it means is that gap is so precise, and this is something that I can give you a rule of thumb. Like for example, on this short 30 axle-to-axle bow at my draw length of 31 inches, I have a little bit less than 1 millimeter of gap right there, because all that gets taken up once I come to full draw. Now if I had a shorter draw length, then that would be a little bit different. I wouldn't have to have as much of a gap. Most of the time, about 1/2 mil is kind of where I start. I like to take the nock of my arrow, I put it on there, and I kind of make sure that I can move it up and down about 40 degrees so that it gives that little bit of space that will then kind of mirror that same string angle at full draw, and you won't have any empty space. That space will be nice and snug. So I'm going to show you this here on a shooting machine. So I'm going to draw this back. And now this nock right here actually has some play when it's at rest. And it actually has quite a bit of play. This is going to be what you don't want. This would be too much play. So as this comes back and that triangle gets tighter and tighter and tighter, so you can see I've got a 31-inch draw. So once we get back here, what I can see is there's actually still a space. I can move that arrow up or down. If you've ever done any type of arrow rest adjustment or even nock set adjustment, you know that was about 3/4 of a millimeter of slop. So think if you moved your arrow rest that much up or that much down, or if you moved your nock point, which is more or less what's going to happen when you have too much slop, your nock point can essentially be at the top one shot and at the bottom the other shot. And even if you're shooting out of this shooting machine, I can come back here and I can lift this to the top like that, and I can zero it in and make a shot. It could be dead center. Then all of a sudden I go and next shot I push that down to where now I've lowered the back of the arrow and raised the point of the arrow. Well, now even out of a shooting machine, the impact is different. So what you really want to have is you want to have an arrow that the nock and the nock sets are perfectly, pretty much paired together, so that when you draw back, even if there's a small amount of space at the beginning, when you get all the way to full draw, you want to make sure it's closed shut. Now this is something you could easily do by having someone film you and move in. If you have a shooting machine or a draw board or something like that, you could certainly see if that nock has any variation once you get to full draw. Now I'm going to take this nock out. This is actually a 60-pound bow I've been playing with here for some indoor shooting, and so I'm going to put an indoor arrow in here, and I actually have a slightly different nock. This is a Biter Hunter nock, which I really like, and this nock has, you can see, a little bit of play, but not a lot, just a little bit. It's probably half of what the previous nock was. So this is the nock that I've actually paired for this, and I want to show you the difference in how this is. So as we get to full draw right here, lock that in place. Now if you take a look down here, you'll notice there's no space. So if you get the nock pinch wrong, where there's opposite of what I was just talking about with too much space, if you don't have enough space, well then this is going to show you a different problem altogether, because what will happen if you have not enough space and this is too tight, then once it gets pulled back, it'll start to lift up off the arrow rest. The best way to check that is remove your point out of your arrow, and it'll certainly show you, but if it's lifting off the rest at full draw, then that's telling you have too much pinch, and your accuracy is definitely going to be going down the toilet. So next time you're looking at how your arrow knocks into those nock sets and you're wondering, do I have too much slop or do I not have enough? Keep these things in mind. What I always looked for is I wanted to pull back, and as the string angle gets squished down and your two nock sets are starting to get smaller and smaller as well, I want them to perfectly hold that arrow like that. But I don't want them squeezing the arrow and dictating what the arrow's doing, but you also don't want to have a gap to where you're essentially changing your nocking position every time you make a shot, because it doesn't always go to the same spot. So if you're ever wondering that question, does the spacing of my nock points matter depending on my axle length? Yes, they certainly do, and your draw length. And on top of that, you have to look at not just the axle length, but on some bows, the cam is much further away from the axle, and on some bows, the brace height is much, much shorter. All these things will determine that pinch, but what's most important is you knowing how to check it and getting it right.